May please, if you can, come up close to the microphone, and maybe it can, sort of be recorded more properly. So.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheng. I've been preoccupied with the phenomenon and the issues at hand, and so I'm really grateful and excited to have this chance and to share my some initial thoughts. I thank the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Department, and in particular I want to thank Mindy Marcus, Olga Richmond, and of course our chair, Liu Cheng. My presentation today is not part of my dissertation, but the fundamental questions about the state, everyday life, and social possibilities are the same. Between market and nation, the people who leave North Korea. This is the painting that was put on the poster. This is a 1955 painting by a very celebrated painter in North Korea, Jung Kwan-chul. He ended up painting, of course, these typical socialist realist paintings really for propaganda, but during his younger days, many of his paintings were influenced by the Impressionist artists. And as you can see here, this is not a typical North Korean painting that you would think of. I really like this painting a lot, but more for our talk today, this kind of approach, this attempt to shed this layers and layers of exoticism that is put on North Korea, I think is one of my goals. These are the 4 sections of my presentation. And this is the important areas for the movement of the North Korean people, mostly from the northeastern part of the North Korean, the Korean Peninsula, and into the northeast region of China, mostly in Jilin and the Yanbian prefecture. This presentation begins in an Australian courthouse, where we encounter a collision between international refugee law, South Korean constitutional right, and a North Korean family's struggle for a better life. This collision lays bare the situation of transnational subalternity, in which human rights are suspended as soon as citizenship is forsaken, in which homelessness and exceptionalism surface as general conditions of living, and in which voice and action become helpless in front of juridical power. At the same time, we are given a chance to think about how the refugees' situation of homelessness is related to the universal situation of instability or alienation in everyday life that is created by the state-market alliance. In the mood of Lefebvre and Agamben, the homelessness of refugees and migrant workers acutely represents the everyday condition where rights and protection are really thin and frayed veils of state power and global marketing. We're not subaltern and we're not homeless only because we submit and we consume. The refugee does little of either. Now, turning to the case. In September 2009, Australia's Refugee Review Tribunal in Sydney decided that the asylum application filed by a family from North Korea's Musan, it's a border town in North Hamgyong province, was invalid, that the tribunal has no power to consider it. The decision was based on the reasoning that the woman and her 2 daughters are de jure citizens of South Korea according to its constitution, and therefore entitled to the protection of South Korea before that of Australia. The woman, in the course of 2 hearings, repeated that although she was aware that North Koreans got a citizenship once they enter South Korea, but she did not want to go there. A look at this person's journey is illuminating. The Australian Refugee Review Tribunal, by the way, discloses relatively very detailed records of asylum applications, more than other courts that I've seen. Born and raised in Musan, She was a worker at a mining firm from 1976 from 1992. Busan has a large mining industry. When she got married, she stopped going to work because the working condition was so poor, although her husband continued to work at the mine. And to generate more income, this is fascinating, she started a private business, making and selling alcoholic beverages from home. This was illegal, of course, but there was a steady demand, and payoffs to the local authorities kept things quiet for a time. And her products were sold in large quantities at the local market. At the end of 2008, she fell out of favor with the authorities, and she was arrested and detained repeatedly, and one detainment lasting 3 days and resulting in injuries to her back from torture. And when arrests occurred more frequently and her business shut down, she decided to leave. One evening in January of 2009, without saying goodbye to her husband, her 2 sisters, and her parents, she and her 2 daughters left their home. And with help from a local doctor, they arrived at a cross point of a river. This river is the Tuman River, which flows 323 miles from Mount Paektu to the East Sea or the Sea of Japan. Some parts of the river are narrow and shallow enough to cross by foot, even for children. Those who can't afford to pay off the guards often take this natural path. On the other side is China's Yanbian, officially called Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, where around 1 million Koreans have been living for generations as Chinese citizens. These are the Koreans who are recognized as one of China's 55 official ethnic minorities, 조선족, and the accepted languages here are both Chinese and Korean. The 3 women crossed the border right before dawn. Border guard accepted a bribe of 500 RMB per person and even helped them with the crossing. That's about $80 per person. The price varies, and I've heard some guards charging as low as $20. Once in China, they headed for Yeongil in Korean. This is the largest city in the prefecture with 500,000 Koreans. They went there not only because of the large Korean presence, but also because the city has an established network and market for people like them, enabling them to find lodging, work, and the means to go somewhere else. Young women have more opportunities than others, but when opportunities mean arranged marriages to men whom they never met or working at bars, opportunity is a harsh reality in these parts of the world for these people. And all cost cash money, which people from North Korea have little of. So informal money lending is an essential part of the network market here. New life begins in debt. The 3 women found a 1-room apartment occupied by an old Korean woman with PRC citizenship. The mother and 2 daughters shared that room with the old woman for 10 months. Living with her was their job. They were paid 600 RMB a month to take care of her. That's about $100 a month. There was a Christian minister who visited the old woman regularly, and he became the coordinator of their journey once they decided to seek asylum in another country. In the course of 10 months in Yanji, the minister helped them obtain fake Chinese passports and plane tickets to Australia. In October 2009, they took a bus to Beijing and caught a flight to Sydney with only carry-on bags, accompanied by someone experienced in this kind of transaction. They arrived in Sydney on a Sunday, and the next day they were dropped off at the Department of Immigration, and they had no documents. For the next year, as undocumented people in Australia, the family from Busan fought the juridical system so they can live legally in Australia. The Department of Immigration turned them down first, saying that the applicants are not persons to whom Australia has protection obligations, because as North Koreans, they have effectively protection in South Korea. The family appealed this decision to the Refugee Review Tribunal, and after 7 months, the tribunal found that the 3 women are nationals of 2 countries, North Korea and South Korea, and are therefore prevented from making a valid application for protection visa. And this was despite the mother's claim that she feared the persecution of her husband, sisters, and parents once the North Korean government finds out that she and her daughters went to South Korea. She had heard that DPRK authorities targeted the family of those who went to South Korea. A death sentence for parents, she said. She was also worried as to whether South Korea was indeed appropriate and safe location. But in the eye of the Australian court, albeit sympathetic, the voice and action of the woman and her two daughters did not matter as much as their juridical situation. First, the force of the woman's everyday practice that helped her to survive the 90s and to make the forbidden journey gave way within the frame of law. Second, the force of international refugee law that gives anyone a right to move to a different country to avoid persecution, that gave way within the frame of the nation state, in which the South Korean constitution took precedence. The result for the three women is the situation of liminality, a situation of exception from the protection of the nation state Australia and from the protection of international human rights. This is a situation of suspension between living as undocumented people and living with a chance of persecution. The being in practice who emerges in everyday life to reconfigure the demands of state and market forces is at least temporarily submerged in the transnational situation of subalternity. Among various works, as it may be apparent to some, I am coming first from Agamben's work on the exceptional state of refugees. That the refugee unhinges the old trinity of state, nation, territory to emerge as the central figure of our political history is an idea that resonates strongly today. On human rights, too, he is provocative. Let me read you this quote. "It is time to cease to look at all the Declaration of Rights from 1789 to the present day as proclamations of eternal meta-juridical values. Human rights, in fact, represent, first of all, the originary figure for the inscription of natural naked life in the political juridical order of the nation state. Rights, in other words, are attributed to the human being only to the degree to which he or she is the immediately vanishing presupposition of the citizen." The other important thinker in my analysis is Lefebvre. His idea of everyday life as an alienating situation created by the market and marketing helps us to think about how the refugee is no longer the other, but the central figure that describes our modern condition. The homeless refugee and the alienated modern being discover each other, within each other, in everyday life. I don't want to spend too much time on this point, but I want to tell you that one of my aims is to describe how the historical and political economic conditions of North Korean refugees helps us to critically investigate the general situation of modern life. State that follows, market that pulls. This is something by Barth. Man achieves an awareness of the working class condition only when the poor man and the proletarian coincide under the gaze and the blows of the police. This is from his writing, his review essay of Chaplin's Modern Times. And here, what is important to me is this over-determination of symbols. The movement of North Koreans is a phenomenon. And as a phenomenon, it is very much tied to our perception of our symbolic rendering of that event. They go by many names. In South Korea, the most common term is defector from North Korea, 탈북자. In 2005, the Ministry of Unification came up with a friendlier term, new settlers. 세터민. When the Lee Myung-bak presidency started in 2008, the friendly term came to be used less, and the preferred term by the government nowadays is residents who escaped North Korea, 북한 이탈 주민. What's almost never used are the terms refugees and asylum seekers, although many North Koreans who make it to South Korea may be better off with these labels. There is also a category that exists in both North Korea and South Korea, and that is citizenship. According to the Constitution of South Korea, a person from North Korea is automatically a citizen of South Korea because South Korea's nationality has a territorial aspect that consists of the entire Korean peninsula. This strange legal condition comes from both the longing for unification in a legal form and the still very much alive anti-communist logic that refuses to recognize the sovereignty of North Korean statehood. The name of the citizen entitles North Koreans with many benefits, but at the same time, it erases the choice of migration to Australia, for example. An interesting name designates the younger people, whatjb. This term refers to children and young adults who roam the streets in groups. The term is derived from the Russian kochevie, meaning nomadic, and it is also a homonym in Korean for a migrating bird, the swallow, jebi. But it doesn't come from the word jebi. It just sounds like jebi. Whatjb are in North Korea as well in China, and they survive by begging and scavenging. There are also some of the most common images of representational images of these people. This group almost always takes the natural route across the Tuman River, and they move in and out of North Korea more easily than adults. But elsewhere, in China, Thailand, Australia, and the US, North Koreans are categorized as illegal aliens, Korean Chinese nationals, fake of course, asylum seekers, refugees, prostitutes, bar girls, and brides. Some people are beginning to label them as migrant workers, 이주노동자, because their daily situation is very similar to that of migrant workers. I myself support that term, migrant worker, but it is also a narrow term since if they're in South Korea, they are automatically citizens. Their names vary according to legal stipulations, but they also vary due to different political identities given to them by various sectors in civil society. What do they call themselves? Perhaps this is an important question to some. In South Korea, most seem to be comfortable using the term defector. But this question is more than just about names. This question is about their own symbolic representation in language, and I haven't come across this kind of study just yet. Let's look at some numbers. This is going to be really helpful. Since the 90s, when food shortage, famine, natural disasters, regime change, and economic decline, and unbalanced market development began to push North Koreans out of the peninsula, the number of undocumented North Koreans in China at any given point has ranged from 50,000 to 200,000. In 1999, when the worst effects of the food crisis devastated the country, close to 200,000 North Koreans were living in China, undocumented. This point in time seems to have been the apex, and the number has decreased since. In 2002, China was the home to approximately 100,000 undocumented North Koreans. Their number in China today seems to be about 50,000, and the decrease was especially salient from 2008, the year of China's celebrated Olympic Games, when border control became more strict. Out of several 100,000 who have left North Korea, the number of people who have gone to South Korea is very small. As of September this year, 24,193 people have made the journey to South Korea. If we look at this history from the end of the Korean War in 1953 to 1998, the total number of North Koreans who had entered South Korea was 947. And this was mostly the people crossing over in the post-Kim Il-sung era. The number dramatically increased in 2000 when the number reached 1,000 per year. In 2006, the number went over 2,000. The year 2009 saw the most people come to South Korea at close to 3,000. Last year, we saw 2,700 people make it to South Korea. Perhaps the most striking feature here is the gender dimension. Until 2000, men entering South Korea outnumbered women 8-1. This began to change in 2002, and the number of women increased exponentially compared to men. In the past 6 years, we have seen 3 times as many women than men entering South Korea. In 2010, 589 men came to South Korea, while the number of women was 1,812. So far, 70% of all North Koreans in South Korea have been women. This year, the Ministry of Unification expects the total number to be a little less than 2,000 for the first time in 2005. Border control has become more extensive since December of 2011 when Kim Jong-il died and as North Korea goes through another transition. Most of them are young, between the ages of 20 and 40. And majority of them live in Seoul, Gyeonggi, and the Incheon area, near the capital. Okay, let's move on. Some major happenings related to these numbers should be mentioned. The second half of the 90s with Kim Il-sung's death in July 1994 was probably the most difficult period for the people of North Korea. The number of people who died directly from famine is estimated to be between 240,000 and 420,000. But the deterioration of living conditions since the year 2000 has caused excess deaths of 600,000 to 850,000. So in the past 2 decades, between 800,000 to 1.2 million people died because of tremendous amount of hardship. This period was the beginning of the Kim Jong-il era, marked by the introduction of the military first policy, which began in January of 1998. The military first policy was the exceptional state of military control over North Korea's politics, economy, and production in response to the horrific conditions of the ordinary people, and, this is just as important, and their unwillingness to live and work under the system. Although more international aid came in between 2000 and 2008 than ever before, the widespread market relieved some dire needs, but the number of people coming to South Korea did not drop. 3 situations may be related to the increase in the flow of people. First, the economy simply has not improved. There's even evidence that the famine may be returning to North Korea. Second, the growth of China's economy and its various market demands have pulled many North Koreans out of the country as workers in the informal labor sector. And third, probably the most important factor, due to the size of North Koreans in China and due to a growing international humanitarian interest, there has developed a reliable network of resources for the North Koreans to make the journey to South Korea. How can we explain the high percentage of women? There has formed a large marriage market between North Korean women and Chinese men, brokered in a complex way by North Koreans, Korean Chinese, and Han Chinese. A lot more women than men enter China to begin with for reasons such as arranged marriages, and the ratio is carried to South Korea. I have not heard of marriage brokering in South Korea yet. Getting to South Korea is a complex process. The only way to get to South Korea is through a South Korean embassy. And getting to a South Korean embassy requires being in a country that will not automatically criminalize and deport the North Koreans. Officially, China is not such a country, and the entry into a South Korean embassy in China has involved rushing the embassy gate, which has made headlines but very few successful cases. China's legal world, I'm talking about the official legal world, the informal economy, the informal world is actually very friendly for the North Koreans. China's legal world is very difficult for North Koreans because the two countries have bilateral agreements, 1961 and 1986, to return any border crossers without a valid travel document. So here's an interesting phenomenon that has to be some kind of a demonstration of human strength. A very restrictive refugee policy by China is not reducing the number of people who are crossing the border. For the past 10 years, the country that is less difficult to undocumented North Koreans has been Thailand. In fact, the majority of North Koreans who make it to South Korea come via Thailand. In 2011, over 2,000 of them arrived in Bangkok. But lest you think that Thailand is some kind of a refugee haven, it must be stressed that getting to Thailand and being there are very arduous. North Koreans first make the journey from northeast China to Bangkok as a person without any papers, the distance of which is similar to the east-west distance of the United States, passing through Vietnam, Laos, or Burma in the process. Once in Thailand, North Koreans turn themselves into the police. Thailand does not recognize them as refugees, but as illegal travelers. Thailand, however, does not punish them as harshly as other countries, and this makes all the difference. For breaking the Thai immigration law, North Koreans are detained in Thai jail for 10 to 30 days, after which they are transported to Bangkok to be turned over to the South Korean embassy. And this is where they undergo the process of becoming a defector. The journey to Bangkok is expensive, $2,000 to $10,000 per person, because it goes through so many brokers and layers of networks. They go through a lot to make that money, to say the least. Theirs is a difficult world, unprotected from the local authority and the perils of the informal market. A small number of them enter South Korea, but most of them do not choose or cannot afford to choose the southern state as their final destination. Tens of thousands remain as undocumented people in China, Mongolia, Thailand, Laos, and Burma. They live as extra-legal beings in countries where transitioning into official immigration or refugee asylum is very rare. Some countries, however, have recognized them as official refugees. A refugee is only a true refugee when a government grants them the status of a refugee. The UNHCR reports that at the end of 2011, the number of North Koreans recognized as refugees was 1,052. They are in North America and Western Europe in equal numbers. When they enter South Korea, their life is guided by a piece of legislation called the North Korean Refugee Protection and Settlement Support Act, 정착지원법. This law was first introduced in 1997 and has been amended several times, the last one in 2010. In the law, an eligible North Korean is defined as someone who has residence, family, spouse, and job in North Korea and who has not attained a foreign nationality since leaving North Korea. This law also states that the South Korean government, accepts all North Koreans residing in a foreign country if they wish to enter South Korea, and if their stay in that foreign country has been less than 10 years. Their first experience in a new country is at the National Intelligence Service, Korea's equivalent to the CIA. The NIS can detain and examine them for up to 180 days. After being examined, they are transported to a less intimidating but similar place called the Center for the Settlement Support of Residents Who Escaped North Korea, 북한 이탈주민 정착지원사무소, better known as 하나원. It is an institution of education and evaluation and can accommodate 1,000 North Koreans at a time. The main compound is at Ansong, which can accommodate 750 people, and there is a branch facility at Yangju, which can take 250 people. Adult men and women are separated. Women go to Ansong and men go to Yangju. The time they spend at Hanawan is 12 weeks, and they receive 420 hours of education. Their education involves emotional stability, cultural reconciliation, and they learn about democracy, capitalism, and market economy. And they also receive basic work training, and they get an aptitude evaluation as well. I myself would like to take this training someday. For North Koreans, the most important part of living in South Korea is the settlement support program. This entails basic cash, housing subsidy, incentives, and tuition support. My summary here is very brief. It's a very complex system. Each person gets a one-time basic cash of 6 million won, that's about $5,000, and one-time housing subsidy of 13 million won, about $12,000 each person. And if you're a family of 4, you start your life, new life in South Korea with almost $70,000. This is not alone. Job training and steady work get you cash incentives. A compensation of 500 hours of job training earns you 1.2 million won, $1,000, and every job certificate you earn is 2 million won, $1,800. If you stay at your work for 1 year, that's 5.5 million won, $5,000. If you hold on to your job for 3 years, you get $6,000. Each person can get up to 24 million won in cash incentives on top of your wage if you stay at your job. But if you're jobless, and most of them unfortunately are, unemployment pension is 420,000 won per month. That's about $380. For a family of 4, the maximum amount of unemployment pension is 1.2 million won, $1,000 a month. Cash support is also extended to employers willing to hire North Koreans. 1/2 of monthly wage, or 500,000 won per month, is paid by the government to the employer during the first year. In the second year, the employer gets 700,000 won per month per North Korean worker. Over 1,000 companies receive this subsidy, but steady employment is a major problem. There are other types of cash support. If you're over 60 years old, you get a one-time cash amount of 7.2 million won, that's $6,500. Disability can get you up to 15 million won in one-time pay, $12,000. Long-term medical treatment can get you 800,000 won a month, $650 a month. And if you're a single mother with a preteen child, you'll get a one-time cash of 3.6 million won per child. That's over $3,000 per child. Housing subsidy is available for each public housing apartment, which is crucial in cities like Seoul. Tuition support is very broad. For studying at a public 4-year university, there is no tuition at all for students under the age of 35. For private 4-year universities, subsidy is 50% of the tuition for students under the age of 35. To enroll at a public 2-year college, there's no age limit and it's free. The benefits of living in South Korea, which is set up by a legal framework that is part humanitarian and part anti-communist, are far greater than any ordinary North Korean can ever claim in North Korea. And yet, the number of people who enter South Korea, about 2,500 per year, is relatively small, considering that there are at least 50,000 undocumented North Koreans in China at any given time. That's only about 5% entering South Korea. The large sum of cash money, the long border crossing travel, the sheer amount of time, and the general ordeal for day-to-day survival are making them choose a different path for a new life. Most make the hard choice of living as undocumented people in various parts of Asia. Besides, the life of North Koreans in South Korea is not rosy at all. Although that appalling TV show about young pretty North Korean women talking, singing, and dancing about their unique and exotic identity would try to make you believe otherwise. There is such a show like this. They have established communities and networks of their own, but they experience a great deal of discrimination. They face exclusion in economic activities, in job opportunities, and in educational institutions. Unemployment rate is close to 70%. They have difficulty in making South Korean friends and feel hopeless about finding a partner. They even feel guilty about leaving their family in North Korea, and they even feel guilty about betraying their homeland. So as you may expect, many North Koreans suffer from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. I am moving to my my penultimate section. My last section is very short. Orphans of War, Early History of North Korean Diaspora. If I may change our mode of inquiry here, we can also think about these people as part of the Korean diaspora, North Korean diaspora. This is somewhat of a new way of thinking about the North Korea's undocumented people. Their difficult conditions, their humanitarian crisis, and their need for economic justice are somewhat outshining the fact that these people, as part of a global movement of peoples, are not only changing our knowledge about North Korea, but also giving us a chance to critically think about state control, ideology, everyday life, resistance, and social possibilities. Allow me to get a little historical here. The North Korean diaspora has a fascinating history, and it's a history that goes back to the post-Korean War period. A major difference between post-war migration and today's migration is the role of the state. The first people to leave North Korea were coordinated by the state. A similarity exists as well, and that is the role of the global market. International loans in the first movement and the informal labor market in today's movement. Let's briefly look at this history. In April 1951, when the Korean War was in a stalemate, the North Korean state began to gather and send war orphans abroad. They were sent to East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and even Mongolia. The exact number is unknown, but there seem to have been as many as 10,000 who were sent abroad. For example, between 1952 and 1960, about 3,000 North Korean orphans lived and went to school in Romania, a third of which were in high school and they were college students. The orphans were by no means a rowdy lot. They were selected for potential, sent to be trained as skilled workers and administrators, and fated to return to North Korea. Most returned in the 1960s, but thousands did not. They and their children are living in Europe and Asia today. North Korea's war orphans are not captured in any data, but the movement of North Korea's war orphans to Eastern Europe occurred in conjunction with the first wave of global adoption in the aftermath of the Second World War. This is a very fascinating story as well. More specifically, in the 1950s, Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, they sent thousands of their war orphans to the United States, while North Korea sent its orphans to Eastern Europe. The very countries that sent their orphans to North America were, in the same period, housing, feeding, and educating thousands of North Korea's orphans. Sending war orphans abroad began in the spring of 1951 and continued until the early 1960s. Romania was the first country to receive North Korea's orphans. 300 orphans left North Korea in April and settled in the city of Iasi. As many as 3,000 North Koreans were sent there. Bulgaria received the first group of orphans in June, and by 1950s, some 500 had settled in Dolna Banja. Hungary took them beginning in September, and they settled in Budapest, where they remained until completing university education. Poland had 200 North Korean orphans at a center outside of Warsaw. East Germany, there they lived in the city of Moritzburg near Dresden, and they became active in the Freie Deutsche Jugend. This is the socialist youth organization of East Germany. Mongolia, the second country in the world to establish state socialism, took 190 orphans by July of 1965. And they lived at a large center south of Ulaanbaatar with a very large staff of 95 people. Okay, a look at the political economic situation of post-war North Korea makes this picture a bit clearer. The absolute economic growth exhibited by North Korea for 2 decades after the Korean War was an unbalanced process that did not lead to clear improvements in ordinary life. Even as annual rate reached 40% in the late 50s, everyday life was rife with shortages in clothing, stable housing, and supplementary foods. The overwhelming cause for the uneven growth and the even more uneven distribution of wealth was debt. It's important to distinguish here that I'm not speaking about democracy or freedoms. I'm talking about total economic growth of a country, which can happen under a very despotic regime, like South Korea in the 1970s. For North Korea, as much as things like juche is often blamed, it was also debt. And this was the same predicament as many other poor developing countries experienced in the 1960s and 70s. At the dawn of its golden period, North Korea was repaying a debt that was in the amount of at least 5 billion rubles, used for the Korean War and for post-war reconstruction. The monies came from the Soviet Union, China, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and Bulgaria, the very countries that welcomed the war orphans. The total debt was about half of its gross national product in 1960. The debt to GNP ratio may not seem extreme, but for a country that did not have much hard cash, this meant a dependence on the export of raw materials. Pig iron, copper, zinc, lead, gold, silver, and radioactive materials as payments in kind. Payments in kind did not generate any profit for the state, and the actual living condition improved very little. Much like today's international loans that demand structural changes to the borrowing country, North Korea's post-war economic policy and practice were in no small way shaped by the pressure to pay off the loans. In order to pay the debt and yet keep on receiving aid, there was a tremendous demand for surplus production as well as building international solidarity. The role of the North Korea's war orphans was prescribed by the state in such a political economic situation. The production regime, influenced by the dual need for surplus and solidarity, carved a rational pathway for the orphans' traumatizing and tragic beginning. To a certain extent, they were the unspoken human collateral for the loans. They were carried across the border by the transnational force of the debt. Orphans are once again coming out of North Korea today, this time the pathway carved by the market and paved with poverty, violence, and uncertainty. The force of the state has diminished in some sense, but the remorseless need for surplus, now dictated by the informal market, is perhaps greater than ever. I am now moving to my last part, the paradox of border crossing. As refugees, the North Koreans are part of 72 million people today worldwide who have been forced to leave their homeland due to violence, conflict, disasters, and development. As migrant workers, they are part of today's 86 million people who move across borders for more secure and safer employment. Both categories are useful in helping us think about their situation, precisely because whether refugees or migrant workers, it is crucial to think about their transnationality. The situation of legal suspension that places them in the uncertain world of informal authority and informal economy. One category should not diminish the other category. A migrant worker is no better than a refugee if your world of work is the informal labor sector, where men are likely to be severely exploited and young women are exposed to sexual trafficking. Either category can offer a glimpse of their plight and, of course, their courage. To me, the category that is most troubling is the category of citizenship. As automatic citizens of South Korea, they are given a great deal of benefits, but this legal stipulation erases the possibility of movement elsewhere. They are confined to the nation state before any real chance for migration opens up. As a category of exclusive exchange with the state, citizenship necessarily removes other social possibilities. This is the problem faced by the women from Busan. And this is the problem underlined by agamben, human rights or exclusive rights within the nation state. Allow me to end with a few thoughts which I have no solution for. Why do North Koreans leave their homeland? What does their situation of liminality teach us about our modern life as citizens, consumers, as labor power? Trying to answer these questions is an investigation of paradoxes. Without a doubt, the North Koreans are clearly making a choice when they leave, but the political economy of this setting is not clear at all. It is very paradoxical. Unequal distribution and failed planning, which have created an enormous amount of suffering since the 1990s, happened in conjunction to market liberalization and deregulation. The moment when the people began to leave was when the state socialist economy was failing and market economy was taking over their lives. In fact, we can say that the very things that are anti-socialist, the market, private business, the beer selling, the moonshiner, right, the woman from Busan, commodification, these anti-socialist things, the things that we think are better for satisfaction and social order, were making people leave, instead of finally allowing them to create a new market-oriented life. Today, the freest, most unregulated kind of market exists in North Korea. The world of mass commodity has replaced the world of mass utopia. Conceptually speaking, people are leaving from both systems, from the plan and from the market. What's at work here? It's the regime, but much, much more. One thing that is clear to me is that so much of our assumptions have to be rethought, dismantled. The decisive act of a young woman stepping into a cold river to seek a better life should make us do just that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cheehyung. So we'll open up for questions and comments and discussion.
Explain why you would claim that North Korea is the most unregulated market.
Yeah. The market is everywhere. But what I'm talking about is an informal market that has that is not attached to any kind of global finance system. So it's cash market that is everywhere and that creates jobs and distributes goods pretty much to the majority of the people. I see that as a highly unregulated market. I'm calling it the most unregulated market because it's not supposed to have, at least technically not yet. It's not supposed to have this kind of a situation, but it's very, very large. So that's what I'm referring to. I mean, of course, whether it's the most unregulated,
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really provocative claim that
Yeah.
you make, because at least maybe think about two other questions.
Yeah.
Is that on the one hand, I can see if we place that market right, within the transnational and global skills, and I think your calculation, it's not the most, it's probably one of those kind of exception to what other countries that are so deeply implicated by the global geopolitics. But on the other hand, also back to the question is the North Korean regime is that in the kind of internal informal market that is under quote unquote the North Korean regime, and how is that control regulation handled or not? Right? So there's like two sides of this. Probably you can clarify a little bit.
That's a very difficult topic, but it is a serious topic. It seems like this widespread informal economy that is there only works because the government allows it to work and the government depends on it. So it is officially totally unrecognized, but the nomenclatura has to depend on this market for any kind of social control and for their own survival as well. So there is a definite codependency of these two structures. I mean, we're talking about abstract things here, but in daily life, this is very much of a reality. Bribery, we think bribery as some evil thing that only happens in very corrupt, poor countries, but bribery is one way that people are able to attain goods, have parties for their families. It is one way they can engage in trade and so forth. So this kind of informal economy is really a reality. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. First of all, I found the talk really provocative.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for it. You focused on the first generation of migrants.
Yeah.
But I think by now we can adopt a historical perspective.
Yeah.
Especially in regards to the question of citizenship, which you raised at the end of your talk. What happens to the second, or even if we're talking about people who moved in the 50s, we can already speak about the third generation in relation to state, to human rights, the relationship to the informal market and to the formal market in their places of residence.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. It seems like these second and third generation people are in many ways facing more uncertainties than their parents. Many of them are born simply without any documents. Many of them are sometimes born in China, Northeast China, from undocumented parents, or sometimes through these arranged marriages. But although legally China takes them and registers them as their own citizens. It's a very complex situation. Last month, the United States House of Representatives passed a bill called the North Korean Refugee Adoption Act. This bill was championed by the Republicans. It's coming from their whole compassionate conservatism idea, and this will allow the U.S. government to eventually adopt North Korean refugee babies. They can't be babies in North Korea. Only babies in China that can be verified as North Korean babies to be adopted by American parents. So potentially white middle class American families with these poor North Korean babies. So to me the legal uncertainty and the dangers that they face in this informal market is even greater. But on the other hand, we have generations of these people who have settled in these countries. East Germany, someone told me that there has been a documentary made in Germany about these people. I've not seen them. Who have been totally removed from North Korea's history. But of course, they are part of this history. But yeah, no, I would really like to continue thinking about this question.
Yeah.
So I have 3 questions. So first, you said that if a North Korean returns to go to South Korea, then there are some repercussions to the family.
Yeah.
Is it the case only if he returns to South Korea, but what if he's illegal somewhere in Asia? Is it still?
Yeah. Well, that's a very typical story that is always circulated. That the North Koreans who go to South Korea, their families may be persecuted, sent to prisons or labor camps and such. Actually, there is very little data for that. And it seems like the official government does not really care too much about the ordinary, common North Koreans leaving and their families. But if you're a high-ranking party member or a high-ranking businessman, yeah, that's a different story. That seems to be attached to some kind of persecution, some kind of punishment. But for the vast majority of normal, ordinary people, that doesn't seem to be the case. But there are stories of North Koreans being shot on the border, of their family being sent to prison camps and so forth.
Okay. So my other question is about these marriage markets.
Yeah.
Marriage market. So how do they work if these people don't have documents?
Yeah.
Is it official marriage?
I don't know if they're official. You know, it doesn't have to be official. You know, but it begins. The process begins in North Korea. There are brokers in North Korea, and they say, hey, there's this wonderful guy. He even may be ethnic Korean. He has a farm. He's single, and women, young North Korean women, many of them choose this path, and they follow this broker, and they go to China, and through another broker in China, the two people meet, and they probably have a ceremony and stuff, but she cannot register herself as a new immigrant, so they live as kind of half extra legal couple, but their child is technically okay. If they have a baby, then that baby can be registered as a Chinese national.
You say you have one more?
Yeah. And so how do you feel are the expectations for North Koreans inside who are considering to defect?
Yeah.
About outside? Because it seems that when they go there, they don't feel so well. Say you go to South Korea, they don't feel so well about being there.
Yeah.
But there seem to be apparently positive expectations about defecting when they make a decision to leave.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm trying to point out, at least conceptually, some of the difficulties that they face and some of the legal limitations of defecting to South Korea. But once they go there, no one returns. Hardly. Actually, last year there was one woman who actually made a journey back to North Korea, and she actually became pretty famous, and she was interviewed in North Korean TV. But I think she's the only case. They faced a lot of difficulties and discrimination, but of course, all of them would choose South Korea over any other, especially the life that they had in North Korea or even in Northeast China. But getting to South Korea is so difficult, and that, to me, is the biggest barrier. It costs a lot of money, and you have to go to Thailand as an undocumented person and be jailed, essentially, in order for you to make that progress. It takes on average 4 years. So, during that time, most of the people leave the system. They remain and live as undocumented people. But will they take that $70,000 and go to China? Yeah, of course. All of them would. But it's just a very difficult system.
Anyone else?
Fascinating topic so much.
Thank you.
I really find it interesting and refreshing that you're linking this with the orphan issue. I've never encountered that linkage before. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, because there's some very interesting kind of repetitions in history.
Yeah.
Right after the Korean War, as you talked about the orphans to East Europe, but also orphans to America and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And this is very much part of the state policies. On the one hand, there's a war directly affecting these countries.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, this sort of compassionate, sort of conservatism that takes in the orphans as an exchange for the violence of war, and this kind of contradiction that's that goes across the socialists as well as the so-called democracies from the past 1950s until the present. So can you kind of talk through the linkages?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And of course, you, Amy, you have thought a great deal about migration and movement as well. It seems like adoption, movement of babies, essentially, right? It seems to be a post-colonial rule for almost all post-colonial countries. Seem to be doing this in some kind of a stage of their development where there is a demand by usually a country that lends them a lot of money. Also, has this demand to adopt their babies. And of course, the situation with North Korea was probably different. This was coordinated by the state and sent there. And they were not technically called adoptees, but they were in many ways taken care of by families in Eastern Europe. They are not part of the whole global history of adoptees in the post-war period, but I think they can very well be entered into that history. I mean, there is this incredible flow from the entire peninsula, South Korea as well. South Korea, for 40 years, they sent 100,000 babies, mostly to the U.S. And North Korea doing the same time, a country that is very proud of its ability to take care of its people and to promote self-reliance, sent their own babies, 10,000 of them. But there's also a global force working at the same time, and to me that is things like aid, loans, debt, which have affected many poor countries since in the post-war period.
Maybe from students? I'll make sure he doesn't give you bad grades if it's not a good question.
I have a question. Can you provide more information about the ideology of this nation? Because it seems that the ideology of North Korea was totally controlled by the ruling party.
Yeah.
From the funeral, I think from the funeral day of the former leader at last December.
Yeah.
It looks like the people are really sad about his death, and it looks like they're very loyal to this party. I wonder if they are exaggerating the emotion or they really feel this way.
That's a very good question. In many ways, that question has no answer, and it's probably both. These people were genuinely sad, and at the same time they were performing. And grief, mourning is a cultural thing. It seems like, and there have been studies on this. But mourning and grief has a strong performative aspect to it. That people grieve because that is required of you. That is what is required of you. And of course, when such a big event like the death of Kim Jong-il happens, then that kind of moment calls for some kind of a nationwide grief. But we should not be misled. We have very good evidence that the collective mourning and grief was limited to a very small group of people. Probably the upper, very small group of people in the upper class who actually mourned in public. They number in thousands, and when we see them on the screen, that's a lot of people mourning together in a very strange, exotic way. But we have really good evidence that most of people in North Korea did not act that way.
One more question.
Yeah.
If what you said is true, do you think it's very dangerous because the party will have difficulties in controlling the people, and the party in the past is very proud of the people's loyalty to the party, but now people can think independently.
Yeah.
So it's more difficult to ask those people to comply to the party.
Dangerous in many ways, yeah. I think the people who are leaving North Korea and also people who are freely going back and forth across the border, bringing in with them information about other places, media, dramas, cultural things. These things are physically changing the landscape of the North Korean society. That is definitely true. I would say that North Koreans are today very much aware about the world, and what's going on out there, what the young people are listening and consuming and wearing, North Koreans are perfectly well aware of these things. They are not contained within some kind of a right, and they have never been really that contained. It is our image. Okay. Does that mean that that's going to change the system? Does that mean that is going to topple the regime? That's a different story, and that's a different matter. It seems like regimes survive very often detached from the so-called society. And that is the case in North Korea today. North Korea that we know now, that is in the media, the world of Kim Jong-un, is about 2 million people. And they keep the regime going. And they keep the state system going. Because they have the military, they control the secondary economy, and so forth. The society is working at a very different level. I mean, we're talking about structural things, we're talking about abstract things, but that's, the society seems to be on its own in many ways. For example, in conjunction with this very widespread informal economy that is in North Korea, market economy. So we have to separate these things. Change is happening, but that change does not necessarily mean collapse of the regime.
Do a couple more? Or maybe I'll ask a question. So what happened to the 3 women?
Yeah. I don't know. But legally, they can just stay in Australia.
They can or they can't?
They can.
They can, right?
Yes.
As an illegal sort of...
Yeah, as undocumented, illegal people. Australia has many of them going there from Asia.
Well, the real question actually is not just that, but I mean, there are 2 things. I'm sort of, I don't know. I mean, one is agamben and everyday life.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I wonder how you reconcile agamben, sort of the state of exception, in terms of this really almost totalizing, sort of reliance on the notion of the law as abiding, as banning, and so on and so forth. And your much more nuanced, seems to me, the notion of the everyday life, which is really about living, about life, biopolitics, right? So it seems to me there's a disjuncture. I mean, or maybe not a disjuncture, but how you sort of see that, on the one hand, relying on agamben's sort of notion and thinking about this global, sort of, right? I mean, but also about the everyday that you work on, right? I mean, the life, right? So that's one. The second thing is I really like the kind of paradox that you brought out at the end. I think that's wonderful. I mean, I don't think we need an answer, but the idea is that our sympathy or empathy to the refugees should not stop us from reflecting our own condition, right? In the way that how we are actually more and more becoming like a refugee from work, from everyday life, or alienation, and so on and so forth. But not only that, it's our system, right, or a different version of our system that's contributing precisely to the kind of plight or right that and as you said, there's 80, 90, 70 million people are suffering. So in that sense, I mean, I really like that because I think there's too much of demonization of the state. That's not to say the Korean, North Korean state is good.
Right.
But then I think, how can we like sort of take on a much more nuanced understanding and not become, hooray capitalism, crappy socialism, right? I mean, that binary, right, which we see in the media.
Yeah.
Right? So that's just an observation. I really like that ambiguity.
Well, Leo, you have put into words that makes more sense than the thoughts that I had in my head. That's those were the exact things that I was wondering about. Okay, agamben is very powerful. When you read his words, he's just pure force. He takes a big punch. But it is really difficult to see how it is applied in daily life, especially for, say, middle class people like us, or middle class comfortable people in a very comfortable life. I mean, how does the refugee situation really shape our condition, and how is the refugee a universal being for us? It's a very difficult linkage, but he wants us to make that connection. For him, right, I mean, the refugee is how we need to rethink about our modern life. Okay, so I was going from there and trying to connect that with our actual situations of modern life and everyday life that is conceptualized by Lefebvre. But it is really the situation that comes from Marx. There is a category, even for the most bourgeois life, that is about alienation, that is about isolation, that is about being detached from your social, your true being, that is caused by the capitalist world, or this mode of production. And to me, that is how, at least for now, that is how I'm trying to make that linkage. Agamben is asking us to think about the refugee as a universal being, and Marx is asking us to think about alienation as a universal condition created by the mode of production that is everywhere. I'm making that link, and that is at the everyday level, conceptualized by Lefebvre.
Because I was thinking more like, I mean, in order to become a citizen, right? I mean, so let's say you're a North Korean refugee,
yeah,
right? So the path becoming a South Korean citizen, you have to give up something.
Yeah.
Right. So you always give up or you give in order to participate in the designation that the state afford you, so you can maybe stay on job for that $7,000, right?
Yeah.
So I guess for me, it's like what's interesting is that it's really about us giving up something, right? The social possibility, any other possibility, then we submit ourselves to that category, right? I mean, that's the powerful thing, no?
Okay,
we don't think about that, right? Usually, we think that we are citizens because we're endowed, right? That we're born here, therefore we are a citizen. But what we don't think about is that we actually give up other things, right? We cannot travel everywhere easily. We cannot, decide to I want to relinquish this. I don't. I mean, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why I was thinking about it.
Yeah. That's a really good point. One thing that I was trying to do was actually, try to be really careful about this analogy at the same time. In Korea, when I was there, I was involved in the migrant workers activism there. They have a union, unrecognized by the federal system, but they have a large nationwide union, workers union. And my job was to think about the global perspective, think about theory, and bring in, do seminars, do study groups and stuff. But one of the first things that I had to get rid of was to see myself in equal terms, to see myself as a migrant worker, because I was a migrant worker technically. I was a legal migrant worker getting paid and so forth. But so I said, one time I said, hey, so I was talking to the president from the Philippines. This guy has gone through so much, but now he had to give up his position, has gone to the Philippines. But I said, hey, I'm a migrant worker too. Can I join this union? And he said, Cheehyung, we know how sympathetic you are and stuff, but your condition and our condition are very different. And the term migrant worker is only a label in that sense. So, thinking about the North Koreans, I am trying to be careful with this kind of analogy. Hey, I'm a refugee. This kind of mentality that, hey, I don't have a home. I'm an immigrant. I feel you. I know what you're going through. I definitely want to avoid this kind of analogy. It seems like the universal call by Agamben is not about that. It's about how the refugee makes us rethink, reconceptualize everything about our about our condition. But I did try to link it to our daily life, and that was only through Marx as labor power, as an isolated labor power in relation to the production system. But I mean, I don't know. To me, I mean, I have to be careful of when I'm thinking about these people. Yeah.
That sort of reminds me too. And then we think about the refugee. I think if we want to go Marxist, or some of us would like to say Marxian, is there also the internal, categorically internal class differences within the category of the refugee?
Wow. Yeah.
Or the migrant worker that you were describing. Because for me, the refugee conjure up certain kind of image which is actually incomplete, is partial, and is politicized. So, we can take historical route, right, or more demographic, or whatever, right? But just even if we just want to stay within this kind of Marxist discourse, then when we think about any kinds of category or class, the questions that immediately arise, one of the questions that immediately arises, of course, is there that internal class difference within the class that you described, and then you universalize in some sense to advance your analysis, right?
Yeah, Gojin, I think you're absolutely right. It's a partial, it's an incomplete situation. One reason I use that quote by Barthes, where is it? Because I think he's talking about that. This overdetermination of a category, how the worker has been probably the most overdetermined category in the 20th century. How they're supposed to resist, how they're supposed to feel sympathy among the workers, how they're supposed to be fighting the capitalists. It doesn't happen in reality. It's an overdetermined category that is projected by the other. I'm using these terms, but that's what they are. And I think we're doing the same thing with the refugees. They are essentially impartial beings like us, of course. And yet, they are so representative and symbolic because of their life, where they come from. I think it's like what you're saying is something that we need to be critical of. Yeah.
Okay. One more. All right. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. And if you have some question you'd like to ask him, feel free to do so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. I am, this semester, Not in the spring, in the fall. But in the spring, I'm teaching a course on history of socialism in Asia. So it's kind of a bigger course that covers North America as well. Yeah, thanks, Leo. Yeah, but it'll China and Japan as well. As well as oh yeah. Thanks. Hi. Oh yeah. Thank you for the question. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. Oh yeah. No, yeah. 패스로. 예. 그러시구나. 예. 혹시 자료 있으면 하나 사업생 아, 예, 파워포인트가 좋으시겠어요? 이거 이런 거 원래?
퍼포인트 찾아서
예. 파워포인트로 그러면 보내드리겠습니다. 아,
통일부터.
아, 그러세요? 네. YTN에서 여러 번 와 계신가요?
예, 지금.
How many chairs do
아,
you have?
얼마 전에 몇분 만났는데 헬스
네, 반갑습니다.
이쪽에 계속 있으니까요?
예, 이과 2년,
네, 2년.
2년 계약이에요.
Oh, you have enough? Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so you're
Yeah.
putting more chairs.
Okay. Let me turn it back on. I turned it off.
네.
Yes.
시간 되시면 오세요.
아, 오늘 저녁 때 좀 약속이 있어요.
정말요? 다음 주에 뵙겠습니다.
I don't think we need to let this, like, I don't know what to do with this one. I don't know if,
Hold on, I'll.
is Catherine come back in here?
Yeah, she will be in here 3 o'clock. So yeah. So yeah, we
What's your
can
name?
Just keep this table for that one. Yeah, and then. 이걸 다 여기다 넣을 거거든요.
Well, Helen, I'll do
이것만 하나씩 갖다 주세요.
I have to take some of the chairs out.
Sorry.
I'll do the tables, don't worry about the
Oh,
tables.
really?
Yeah, that's
Hey,
okay.
are you
I
guys
know how to
staying
do
for the
it.
party later?
Not now. We're just helping you.
they will come back again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, some chairs fine.
I know, I have to move them out to get the tables. Of course.
Maybe I'll go get more.
What do you study?
Yeah, these have to go in a certain way, so.
Oh, okay.
You sure you don't want us to help?
No, it's
Oh,
okay,
okay.
it's real easy to do, and I know how to do them, so.
Do you want the PowerPoint or do you want the paper?
Tables go real fast.
그러면 그냥 의자만 좀 편안하게 놔주세요. 여기서 제가
오케이.
터치를 할 거니까.
네.
Fit them all in here.
Oh, we did.
Yeah, it's a lot easier than it used to.
What year are you? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Are you, are you going to a lot of these talks?
Well, leave one table out, because I'm gonna put it back over
Yeah.
there, the that hay table, so leave that one. You have to put it over there anyway. Well, I just need one, but.
Okay.
Did you know any North Korean person while you were in China? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think we actually lost the
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Okay.
This last one that fits in here, can I get in here? I'll put these against the wall.
Alright.
Because there's just no room.
아,
No, there's no room for this other chair.
네.
네. 이따가 봐요.
진아 씨, 이 의자를 그냥 all the way back 저 뒤에 이렇게 놔주실까요? 진아 씨. 의자가 부족하면 네. Not that around, yeah.
Yeah, kind of this shape, but kind of the other, yeah, your shape, but very kind of really the other shape.
Take a look. It's,
Not the pen.
I'm gonna put that one, see, next to that table over there, it'll just fit right in there.
yeah. Bye.
Better keep these chairs in case.
예, 이따 뵙겠습니다.
네.
See you guys later.
I'm just gonna push the tables up here. Is this gonna be in your way? Is that okay? Okay, I'll get this table. Yeah, I guess Catherine's gonna have to. I should lock this one.
Good. Wow. 너무 clean하지 않아요? Too clean or fine? 이 정도 될것 같아요. I think it's over. Yeah. Maybe you want another one? Roll here. Yeah, with that. Chair and roll.
Is there enough chairs?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, you have those are stacked.
And yeah, I will ask about this too.
Yeah, I don't know. So you don't need this.
I don't know, but yeah.
Because that's the way Shai's going to have it too, so it's
Okay,
perfect. So you
yeah.
don't have to do anything.
So can I?
You just leave it.
All chairs? Okay.
Yeah, because he could stack them. He has 39 people. So they can always, yeah, but they're not in the way. I think that's fine.
So I will leave like this shape.
Just leave it like that.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that's
that's perfect.
perfect.
Okay. Well, hope you have fun.
Thank you.
고맙습니다.
네.
이따가 오세요, 6시에. 네, 그치 말씀 사실. 네, 이따가 또 봐요. 네. 못 먹었어요.
조금만 닮아주고 싶나 봐.